Thank you all for attending today. We appreciate you attending the first program of 2022 for SPSP. I first want to acknowledge Sedgwick Brand Protection, who is sponsoring all of our programs this year. And thank you very much. Sedgwick Brand Protection is formerly Stericycle, and you all know who they are. So we thank them for their sponsoring us this year and helping out. I just want to briefly mention the webinars we've got planned so far. We're including this one. We're talking about 8 seminars or 8 webinars for this year. In March, and you'll get an announcement on this fairly soon, we've got Don Mays and George Borlaise are going to discuss standards development and problems with confirming compliance and relying on compliance of standards, some issues that people need to be aware of when they are designing their products. In April, we've got part 2 of the recall preparation program that we did last year. We're going to take it a little further and a little bit more in depth. Chris Harvey from Sedgwick is going to discuss how to develop a recall plan. And we have an underwriter from Hiscox Insurance who is an underwriter for recall insurance. And she's going to discuss best practices they're looking for in a company that they intend to insure in their efforts for recall preparation. And that should be interesting, both if you are interested in recall insurance or maybe more importantly, just what they consider best practices in recall preparation. In May, we're going to do a webinar on how to train your in-house safety and engineering and marketing people in product safety, regulatory compliance, and product liability issues. And we'll have some in-house folks who are going to talk about how they train their people and sort of best practices and things that work and things that don't work. In June, we're going to do international product safety developments. We've got Rod Freeman and his folks are going to report on that. And then we'll take a break in July. Well, we're not going to do one in February because of ICFSO. We'll take a break in July and August. And then in September, I've invited the chairman, well, September, October, or November, it's his choice, invited the new CPSC chairman to speak at our webinar. One of those months, and but he's invited, and we'll see if he accepts our invitation. Okay, anyway, let's go to today's program. And we did this a year ago. We have a CPSC update. Actually, Lon, go back on slide, sorry. And here are our speakers today, who you can see on the screen anyway. But we've got 3 excellent speakers. I'm not going to repeat their biographies. You've seen them in the announcement. Just to say that they're all former CPSC attorneys. They all obviously practice in the CPSC and product safety world. And they have insights that us non-CPSC former folks can only have. And so it'll be very interesting to hear what they predict is going to happen in the future, because that's what we're into this year, is a prediction with new commissioners and a new year and a new administration of what's exactly going to happen. Okay, now if you can go to the next slide. Okay, here's the agenda. We'll talk about the organization, compliance activities, rulemaking. Submit your questions during the program. That's fine, and then I'll keep track of that, and hopefully we'll have enough time to answer all your questions. But if there's a problem with getting to everything, including all of your questions, Laud, do the next slide. You can email SPSP after the program if you have questions, either that we didn't answer or that you think of later. Or you can feel free, I hope this is okay, guys, feel free to email our speakers to ask them a question that you didn't have a chance or thought about later. Now we are going to link the seminar and maybe more material at the SPSP website. All of our webinars from last year, the year before, are archived on the SPSP website, and you can look at them anytime you want or have other people at your company do that. So that's all. So, Blonde, you want to get rid of the slides? We'll just have all of us speaking here. And so I want to introduce everyone. We've got Michelle Gillice, Mike Gentine, Boaz Green, and we're going to start with the organizational question. And Mike is going to talk about the new chairman and the other commissioners. And what we kind of divided it up, so each of our three speakers will take a subject, and then the other two can jump in. So you'll get to, everybody will have a chance to contribute and jump in on this, and hopefully it won't be too confusing to you all, but give everybody a chance to participate in everything. So I'll turn it over to Mike to start talking about the organizational issues involving the CPSC. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, thanks very much, Ken, and thanks to Loudon and the entire team at SPSP as well, and of course to everyone in attendance for taking time out to join us. We saw on the attendee list a lot of very familiar names of wonderful people that we haven't seen in far too long, so hopefully that can change in the very near future. As Ken mentioned, CPSC at the commission level and at the staff level, frankly, has seen significant reorganization, significant shakeup in the last year or so. And specifically at the commission level, in the last few months, we've seen the addition of two new commissioners, one of whom is the new chairman that hopefully will be joining this group later on this year. Alex Hohen-Sarek was a former congressional staffer. He took office in October of this year, becoming the first permanent chairman that the agency had in nearly 5 years since Elliot Kay was left that post in 2017. The agency had been under two different acting chairmen during that period, Anne Marie Burkle and then Bob Adler, who of course is well known to everybody in this group. And then we also saw Richard Trumka confirmed later in December as a new commissioner, bringing the total to 4 with still an open seat. And that's a key note to get back to. In terms of what we've seen from those two new faces, well, frankly, not much yet, because there just hasn't been enough time, but I think we saw from their confirmation testimony and the votes they've taken thus far and what communications they've put out, that I do think their approach is going to be consistent with the shift toward more active enforcement that we had seen under Acting Chairman Adler, more of a willingness to litigate, more of a willingness to use a variety of communications tools to get out messages that the Commission thinks are important and protective of consumers. We also see, and this is a personal interest to me, and I think to Boaz as well, that we do see another member of the facial hair club at CPSC, which is always welcome. I still give Bob Adler grief for losing his wonderful mustache. But again, we haven't seen a lot of votes. Trumka really has only been on one substantive vote plus some record-keeping sorts of things. And that was the magnet set vote, and that was unanimous, of course. But again, the message we've seen from them is one of a shift toward greater enforcement, which not only aligns with what we had seen from Acting Chairman Adler, but obviously also the two Republican commissioners, Dana Biacco and Peter Feldman. Feldman especially has been making something of a name for himself as an enforcer, as someone who wants to hold companies accountable to the extent that there are issues in the product safety arena. So I think, what specific shape that trend will take under the new leadership, it's hard to predict. It's hard to predict what issues will bubble up, what will be points of emphasis for certain commissioners, what might be sticking points for certain commissioners who feel that a particular issue is a bridge too far, or a particular path is one that the agency shouldn't take. So the particulars, again, we'll have to wait and see. But I think the overall trend toward greater enforcement is one that's certainly going to hold. And I think that was not only reflected in the new commissioner's testimony, but in the questions and in the statements from the members of the Senate committee during that hearing, that the clear message was they want CPSC to be more active in enforcement than it has been in years past. The open question, the open seat we still face is the seat for which Mary Boyle is nominated. She is currently the executive director of the agency. She had been the general counsel. She's been at CPSC for over a decade and is a name and face that's familiar to a lot of folks on this call, and is someone that I think is well respected throughout the community, certainly somebody I hold in very high esteem. Nonetheless, despite her reputation in this community, she was nominated last year and received a confirmation hearing in July, just as the other two did. And yet her nomination languished in committee. It was never voted out, never got to the floor. It was returned with the end of the first session of the 117th Congress. President Biden very promptly on January 4th renominated her along with 100 or so others for a variety of other positions. So her nomination is once again pending. She would still need to get out of committee. The committee has an option on whether or not to hold another hearing. Typically they don't for renominations like this, but a vote is still necessary. And it's an open question as to whether or not she will get that vote. We have seen, or we've at least heard of uniform opposition from the Republican members of that committee. And of course, right now, with a 50-50 split in the committees, or in the Senate, the committees are also evenly split. And so the Democrats not only need all of their votes in committee to get her out, but because of the rules of that committee, they need all of their votes present. And as anybody who watches the Hill knows, getting 14 senators in the same room at the same time is a challenge. So there is opposition to Mary, both institutional opposition and political. And it's, I think, a fair question whether or not that opposition can be overcome, particularly in an election year. So I would say watch the April-May timeframe. If it's not done by then, we may see that nomination languish again, leaving CPSC with an open seat and with a 2-2 party split. So, you know, the big picture for the commissioners who are currently there, I think, is fairly well set. A march toward enforcement, more aggressive action on behalf of the commission. Again, what shape that takes remains to be seen. But the really big question for CPSC going forward is, will they have a 5th seat? Will there be a majority established so that the commission can move forward on policy objectives? And frankly, I don't think anybody has a particularly clear crystal ball on that right now.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Well, and hopefully we'll know in the fall a lot more, and if the chairman's talking about it or not. Boaz or Michelle, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. Hi. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Ken for inviting me, and thanks Mike for that overview. I do want to talk a little bit about the hiring decisions that the new chair has made so far, because I think that they can also give us a little bit of an insight into what might be happening in the future. His chief of staff, Jana Fong Swamidas, is an old hand at the commission. She was chief of staff under Chairman Kaye, and then stayed on working for Commissioner Kaye until the end of his term. And she knows the chair back from when they worked together at the Hill. So they know each other well, they work well together, and she's very effective as chief of staff and knows the commission very well. He has hired a deputy chief of staff, Anna Layton, who comes from Consumer Reports. So that is an indication of, as expected, a lot of close work with consumer advocates and open communications between commissioners, Democratic commissioners, and the consumer advocates. So they'll have, I think, a lot of influence in terms of rulemaking and other enforcement issues. The hiring of the general counsel, which is also really the prerogative of the chair with commission approval, Austin Schlick, is not a commission insider, but he has a very extensive and very impressive resume. He was general counsel of the Federal Communications Commission, so among other very prominent roles. So he will definitely bring some, I'm sure, very capable management and a real understanding of how to make an agency work and work effectively. And also defend itself from, we know there are some challenges to some rulemaking that's ongoing, and then ongoing litigation that we're going to talk about later. And I think that he will be a big help there. Nothing else has been announced officially, but we do understand that some other people who were at the commission in the past will be coming back in prominent roles. So it's definitely a return to some of the approaches that we saw under the last sort of actual full chair, Elliot Kay, Democratic leadership at the commission.
Okay, thank you, Boaz. I'm going to call in Michelle. Michelle, you can talk about organization if you have something to add on that, and then just keep talking because you're going to start off with the compliance module on corrective actions. So just keep going. All right.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for having me. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone, wherever you're located. I just want to echo what Mike had to say about the enforcement position of the commission at the leadership level. And I fully agree that we're looking at increased enforcement. We just don't know exactly how it's going to take shape. But just to add on to what Mike said, just last week, the chair was interviewed by NBC4 in DC, and he's stated that he wants the agency to be more aggressive on behalf of consumers, and where there's a problem, he wants the agency to go out and be aggressive. So that tells you where he's thinking. And in fact, there was just with that horrible fire in the Bronx, which we understand now from newspaper reports is associated with a space heater. The chair is quoted in the Post, I believe this morning, saying, if there is a defect with this problem, we're going to take care of it. CPSC is going to take action. I didn't get that quote exactly right, but he's putting it out there that they're looking for ways to go out and show CPSC's muscle. But turning now to the compliance organization and the compliance module, I think what I wanted to focus on is at first, besides some of the lawsuits and the more notable enforcement actions that you might have seen in press releases, just sort of the day-to-day process that has changed with the compliance attorneys taking over the defect investigations, the non-fast defect investigations, because some of you might not have experience with that. You might actually just have done fast track recalls and or have done a recall that was not fast track under the old system. So let's say the new system, which is not that new, but really seemed to take effect in the last year and a half, is a compliance unit, the enforcement litigation unit that is run by Mary Murphy and a team of a dozen or so attorneys. And I think the first thing you'll notice that's different is that when it comes time to the company doing a recall, the corrective action plan agreement is negotiated in depth beforehand. And I think most of you might be familiar with putting a corrective action plan in a full report and bullet points, or following up with, more specifics, and CPSC sending an email back saying, okay, that looks good, or having a question, you fill in the question and you're good to go. You send in your recall notifications and the draft press release and you get it ready for recall. Here with the defects team, you negotiate like a 5 to 7 page agreement before you even do any of the recall notifications. And really what staff is looking for is beefed up notification to consumers and outreach. And the way that we're seeing that is they are looking for multiple posts on social media, and they'll send you your accounts where they found your accounts and ask for multiple posts of the recall. They are requesting that the notice of the recall is at the top of your homepage for 120 days. And after 120 days, you can move it somewhere else on your homepage. So this is the position that staff is putting forward. It's an evolving document. It's changed a little bit over the past year. At first, they were requesting that companies post notice of the recall on their websites, quote, in perpetuity. I think they got a lot of pushback from the regulated community that in perpetuity is just, how do you, that's not really workable. And so what I've seen in more recent cap agreements, they've scaled it back, saying you need to post notice of the recall for 5 years. But all this goes to, they want to nail down not just notice, but every aspect of reverse logistics. And so that just adds some time into the recall negotiation and announcement process. So from the nuts and bolts, then I guess we could talk about CPSC's actions in the past year and where we think they're going as far as compliance. I mean, one of the tools in CPSC's tool belt is the unilateral safety warning that they call it, where they can either send 6B notice to a company and have a notice and comment period and then issue a safety warning, or they can find that public health demands that they shorten the period and issue a safety warning. And we saw that with the Peloton safety warning that went out, which was followed soon after by a recall, which is sort of the pattern that you see over years. Usually if there's a unilateral safety warning, a company at some time afterwards chooses to voluntarily recall the product, but in some cases they don't. And then you also see, we've seen 2 administrative complaints that were filed in 2021, which is notable because CPSC does not file administrative complaints very often. And this is all coming out of the same corrective action team of lawyers, so that are handling these administrative litigation. So, what can we get from the Amazon and ThyssenKrupp administrative litigation complaints that sort of would be noteworthy to everyone to take stock of? Because I think this audience is pretty familiar with the Amazon complaint, and a lot of that is CPSC asserting that Amazon is a distributor under the CPSA. It's not just a platform. And that's kind of more unique to Amazon. But I think what we can get from both of those administrative complaints and understanding where CPSC staff is coming from is that, in both instances, the companies have provided notice to the affected consumers and people in the distribution chain. So they provided notice and they provided remedies. But in CPSC staff's view of the world, like, that's not sufficient. If you're going to do a corrective action at a consumer level, we need to be involved, because calling it a CPSC recall and having us help you with the notice and help you with the hazard, we need to be a part of that, and it carries weight in how consumers react to that. In particularly also in the Amazon space, CPSC makes clear that yes, you provided refunds to consumers, but that doesn't take care of everything. The CPSC wants to make sure that the product at issue is taken out of use, is out of commerce, and so they just issuing a refund without requiring a consumer to dispose of it or return it isn't enough. So I think whether CPSC will find reason to file another suit this year, we don't know. But I think that just tells you, how CPSC looks at hazards and actions and what their value add is to this space. Ken, you're on mute.
Yeah. Sorry. Pressing the wrong buttons here. Sorry. Michelle, let me ask you a question before I turn it over to Boaz and Mike. Are these lawsuits coming? Are they coming from? They come from the CPSC. Is it the commissioners? Is it the staff? Mary Murphy, obviously, those who know her, she's pretty aggressive, and that's okay. Is it coming from her? And then also my understanding is the Department of Justice has to agree to bring the action. Is that right? Or is it administrative action beforehand?
No, right. It's just an administrative action. I mean, it's coming from the staff the staff is drafting the complaint, and the staff is drafting the briefing package. And so it's initiated at the staff level, and then it's voted upon by the commission. And I'd say in both of those lawsuits, it was a 3-to-1 vote. So you had Commissioner Feldman joining the Democrats in approving the filing of the complaint. So again, just harking back to what Mike had to say, like, we're already dealing with a very enforcement-minded commission before any changes took place.
Okay. All right. Now I'll open it to we'll start with Mike. Mike, do you have something you want to add on this subject?
Sure, and I think with respect to the Amazon case especially, I have no particular insight on that case, but obviously the question of how the CPSA can or maybe can't adapt to a marketplace, a consumer product economy that certainly couldn't have been envisioned in 1972, I think is going to be a critical one for CPSC going forward. So I think that that case in particular is one to watch very closely, because I think the sort of sequelae that come out of that case will be significant regardless of the actual outcome of the case. I would suspect that if the administrative law judge in that instance finds that CPSC doesn't have jurisdiction over platform marketplaces, that would fuel legislative efforts to address that, and we'll get to those later on. But obviously, if the ALJ and then presumably a district court later on feels that CPSC does have jurisdiction over these platform marketplaces, then that is going to, I suspect, radically reshape how a variety of companies are doing business. Not only the marketplaces themselves, but the manufacturers that sell through them, the retailers and distributors that partner with them. Obviously, I think that would be one of the biggest sea changes we've seen in the CPSC world since the agency's creation in the 70s. So I think that's a key one to watch. I also think, we've seen, as mentioned, we've seen more reach to administrative tools that CPSC has, including unilateral press releases. We've seen, I would say, a lot of those. It's actually 4, which in the normal world isn't that many, but in CPSC world, 4 unilateral press releases in the span of barely a year is significant, and is something that has gotten a lot of attention. So I think that willingness to use those tools is indicative, as we talked earlier, Michelle, about where the commission's heading in terms of its enforcement priorities, but I think also is going to inform, again, future legislative debates on the Hill in terms of how the agency can communicate.
Okay, Boaz, got something there?
Yeah, thanks, Ken, and thanks. And Mike brings a really good point with the types of legislation we might see if CPSC loses on the Amazon case, and that's an example of what we like to say: when CPSC loses, it can still win. It is likely a stretch, at least in some cases, for CPSC to bring Amazon under this category of distributor. But it is definitely a signal also to legislators that CPSC is trying to do something here, but that it may need help with changes to the law. And I think with 2 Democratic commissioners who come from the Hill and 1 Republican commissioner who comes from the Hill, CPSC is probably well poised to work with the Hill to get needed changes in, if the Hill can get anything through itself. But at least in terms of the dialogue between the agency and legislators and committees, I think there's definitely room for it to be fruitful. And these 2 lawsuits are an example of CPSC also being very responsive to issues that legislators and consumer advocates are interested in. So the whole issue of the marketplaces that are perceived to be this Wild West full of dangerous and non-compliant and fraudulent products. Here is CPSC trying to do its best and being responsive to that. And the same with elevators, which were subject to an expose in the Washington Post, whose best friend in the agency left at the end of Adler's term. And then also part of a big sort of report that was done by, I think it was Senator Cantwell, about CPSC and issues with CPSC not being able to really, effectively address some of these concerns. What's going to be interesting about ThyssenKrupp, and I'm just going to put this out as sort of a query or sort of something to watch, is that just yesterday, 3 recalls were announced for residential elevators for the same hazard that is at the heart of the suit, CPSC suit against ThyssenKrupp, which is the gap between the elevator and the hoistway door where children could get entrapped. And there was also a unilateral press release against the 4th company, which I understand is in receivership, which may be one of the reasons why it couldn't announce a recall. But the recall actually provides less to consumers than what ThyssenKrupp is offering through its own program. Definitely in terms of help to consumers to do measurements in the home and to do installation of the space guards that are supposed to reduce the gap. So it puts CPSC in a pretty awkward position with the lawsuit, where really the only thing it seems to be adding in terms of the remedy that it's asking is sort of the CPSC imprimatur of the recall, which Michelle talked about, sort of the fact that the recall is announced by CPSC is supposed to make it all that more effective. I think that that's an open question, so we'll see where that lawsuit goes after yesterday's announcement.
Yeah, and I'll just point out that a lot of these issues come up because of product liability cases brought against the manufacturer, or in the case of Amazon, the distributor. And that's getting litigated, of course, in different courts in different states around the country, in Amazon's case, with inconsistent results. So one document I have the prerogative as the coordinator of these webinars. I'm going to post an article that I wrote, which discusses the interrelationship between product liability and regulatory compliance, because this is a perfect example of how product liability cases can generate regulatory action generate product liability cases, and what does this all mean when you put this all together, which is particularly troublesome, and some companies have had problems because they have not utilized the experiences they have gotten in product liability litigation to then inform them about regulatory requirements. So, and that's created some problems. I wanted to ask a question of any of you. Reporting is obviously the key initial question, and the regulations, as every government agency does, makes them pretty vague to allow for flexibility for them and for the company. And the CPSC has always said for decades, when in doubt, report. Do you see under the new administration, the new commissioners, any changes in that where, particularly because the regulations say basically you have 24 hours from the time you determine you have a defect that could create a substantial product hazard. But I've never seen that quite enforced vigorously. So any change in how we should think about this? I mean, how much time do we have to investigate to then make that decision about whether we are in doubt or not, or whether we have a reporting responsibility or not? Do you see any changes in what's been going on in the past? I'll open that up to anybody.
I'll take that. I mean, you mentioned the 24 hours, but also keep in mind that the regulations allow for 10 days to investigate an issue, which is still to make a decision whether reporting is required, which is still an extremely short time frame. Right. Anyone that's worked in the space knows how short that is. And I can say, from experience, we've never seen a civil penalty settlement that was for late reporting for exceeding the 10-day period. That doesn't mean it's impossible. I think that would, always be determinative on, the facts and if anything occurred, within the period of time between that 10-day period and reporting. But I don't know that I wouldn't expect to hear anything different from what's set forth in the regulations. And I think it's just going to be, something that companies are going to have to grapple with and strive to comply with, and do the best they can to get their report in a timely fashion.
Okay, Mike or Boaz, anything to add? Okay, yeah, and then one other issue would be, and I've done this a bunch, where I'm not admitting that I've got a reporting responsibility, but I file a report, and that I argue that at the moment, we don't believe any recall is necessary. And that could always change later on. 6 months later, you could have other incidents. So the fact that you're filing doesn't mean that you're agreeing to do a recall. You file with the non-fast track group, and you still have a fair amount of time then to continue your investigation, but you've at least cut off your liability for late reporting. But again, in the document I do, I just never admit that I have a reporting responsibility. So by filing the report, I'm not necessarily giving in on that point, and still have an opportunity to argue that I didn't have a reporting responsibility and no recall is necessary. Go ahead, Mike.
And I will respond to that and just say I totally agree. And CPSC will will attest that outside of the fast track cases, only a minority of reports result in preliminary determinations and recalls. And the number I've seen is as low as 20%. Obviously, there are some questions in how you come up with those statistics. But I think that is key. You know, a key message to companies is a lot of times companies don't want to report because they think that will automatically result in a recall. And one, as you say, that's not borne out by the facts. I understand how it feels like that in the trenches, but it's not borne out. But the other point to remember on that is if you're in a situation where you're confident CPSC is going to insist on a recall, then because the recall threshold is higher than the reporting threshold, you already know you've got a reporting obligation. So I think if it's we're going to have to do a recall, then you know you need to file a report. So I think that's something to keep in mind, is that if you're having that second level discussion, then you need to take care of the first responsibility first.
And the other thing is, I think it's a very good point that Mike raises, that the majority of sort of your non-fast track 15 reports do not end in a recall. I think a lot of that will depend on who is it that's reporting and what's the issue. So, in some cases, I can tell my clients that, this is probably going to be something where CPSC might push for a recall, not necessarily because it's such a significant hazard, but it could just be either the company or the type of product that we're dealing with, where there's just less room for flexibility from CPSC. But what reporting does give you is also the ability to make good decisions going forward about your product and what you do with it. So if you are contemplating changes to the product, maybe some of them are unrelated, but some of them might be in some way prompted by sort of this issue and the complaints that you're getting from your consumers. Reporting means that you at least take away the potential liability for CPSC to then look at that subsequent change that you've made and take that as an indication that you acknowledged internally that there was a safety issue and you went ahead and did this change. It's a silent recall. It's an admission of a duty to report, and it kind of makes the case for them that you didn't report at the time you decided to go ahead with that change. So there's a lot of benefit to reporting, but there's risk because it does invite CPSC sort of into your files, and even if you don't end up doing a recall, dealing with CPSC can be a distraction. It can take a lot of time, and especially now that it's lawyered up, you get much more incisive and intrusive questions from staff in many cases.
Yeah, and I want to point out that a Section 15 filing with the CPSC is usually not going to be divulged by the CPSC under a FOIA request because it contains business confidential information. However, the company has that 15B filing in their files, and therefore it's going to be discoverable in a product liability case. And it's something that I discuss in this article that I'm going to post. So you want to be if you have litigation or anticipate litigation, consult with a product liability lawyer to talk about what are you going to admit or not admit or say or not say in that filing, because you may have to defend it later on in the event of litigation, because that will be disclosed to the plaintiff in that case. Okay, well, let's move on to compliance and the other piece of compliance, penalties and other enforcement. And I'll turn that over to Boaz to take the lead on that.
Thanks, Ken. And then I'll go back to that question that you posed just a few minutes ago about sort of with the new commission, are we going to see a stricter view of sort of this timeline, the 24 hours and 10-day investigation? And really, we don't know, because it has been uncharacteristically quiet, at least publicly, in terms of civil penalties. For about 2 years under former acting chair Burkle, there were no civil penalty settlements for late reporting or for sale of recall goods, which was a big break from the past, and definitely a big break from how it was under Chairman Kaye, who pushed very hard to reach the top statutory penalty of, at the time, it was a little over 50 million for GRE, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and then a $27 million settlement and change settlement with Polaris, but that was for multiple issues. So that's how we could get above the maximum for a single related collection of violations. But then we saw two settlements come out end of 2020, beginning of 2021. One was Kitty for the fire extinguishers, which was a settlement with DOJ, meaning that CPSC and the company were unable to reach a settlement, and that CPSC must have then referred it to DOJ, which then stepped in and probably at the threat of litigation, Kitty agreed to a settlement, which was fairly large. It was over $12 million. And then in February of last year, there was a settlement with Cybex for around $7 million for two different products, exercise products that had caused some significant injuries and some significant delays, at least allegedly, in reporting. But there's been nothing since. That's not to say that the Mary Boyle's team is not actively investigating, but they haven't brought any complaints up for the commission to approve as far as we know, because those proposals wouldn't become public until voted on. It could be that they are waiting for a more favorable commission. A 2-2 commission is unpredictable. There's a lot of work that staff puts into investigating and negotiating a settlement. They want that to be approved. So there's just an inherent hesitancy from staff to bring big decisions up to the commission if they don't know how the commission will vote. Commissioner Feldman, for a Republican, is definitely, at least in terms of his statements, very pro-enforcement, but it's not clear whether that extends to late reporting versus sort of enforcement of sort of traditional recalls, et cetera. And so we don't, there is a lot of uncertainty about how he and Commissioner Bayalko would necessarily vote on a civil monetary penalty. There was, at least, it seemed like there might be a Democratic majority soon. I don't think a lot of people expected the delays that we're seeing with Mary Boyle's nomination. So it could be that there are just a lot of cases that are just waiting for a better chance of being approved. So we might see a lot of activity there soon. But definitely talking to other lawyers in the field, we know that there are investigations going on. We just don't know where they will lead to. The commission did adjust the penalties for inflation, so now they've gone up to a little over 17 million maximum for a related series of violations. So we may see higher penalties there, and there's definitely appetite, at least for some in Congress, to increase the cap even further, which I'm sure that under the right leadership at the commission, they will jump on that opportunity to impose higher penalties like that. So we don't know really where the commission will end up in terms of the types of settlements that it will reach. Historically, you were unlikely to see a penalty for late reporting in a case that didn't involve injuries and didn't involve an actual recall. We might see the commission be more aggressive, and injuries are not really required to prove a duty to report. So we may see them show aggressiveness with a settlement for late reporting in a case where there were no injuries. The other thing is the older settlements were all done when the lawyers were all in the Office of General Counsel and not in the Office of Compliance. So they would have to wait for compliance to finish the matter, and then compliance to refer the case to the Office of General Counsel. And as a general matter, General Counsel's office didn't reach into the files for enforcement. So the referral would happen after there was a recall, which sort of would be an indication that there was a duty to report. But now that the lawyers are in compliance and are seeing the cases from the beginning, they may decide to bring a late enforcement case, even if the company never agrees to do a recall. And we do see, at least in some cases, just in the way staff is, especially the lawyers, ask their questions, that they are looking at kind of the recall itself, but they're also looking at sort of what else might we want to look at with this company. So that's just something to pay attention to, because if you're reporting, doing a 15B report that's not fast track, it will be seen by the lawyers. And the lawyers are interested in more than just recalls. But the big news last year, in terms of penalties for violation, was obviously the criminal penalty against GRE, which pleaded guilty to violations of the Consumer Product Safety Act. It had been the first indictment and now the first conviction of a company for criminal violations of the act, as opposed to violations by individuals. The penalty was around 91 million, which they got a discount. I mean, the 15 million that they paid as part of the CPSC penalty was credited toward that amount. There are also two officers of the company that had been indicted, and those cases are still moving forward. So we don't know how they will resolve. I mean, GRE was a especially egregious case, both in terms of just the sheer number of dehumidifiers that caught fire, but also some of the internal communications at the company, but with blatantly discussing, not reporting until after the holidays. Plus falsified UL certifications regarding the flammability of the plastic casing. So there were a lot of very egregious issues there, which led to the criminal referral that DOJ sort of ran with. But from discussions that we've had with other people who do this kind of work, DOJ does seem emboldened on this criminal issue, and isn't necessarily going to wait for CPSC to do a referral before it decides to jump in with some of these investigations. So that's something that companies need to look out for. A big part of the penalty inquiry wasn't just the actual fine, but there are also a lot of undertakings, including compliance programs, but also hiring an external third-party expert to oversee the company's work in terms of enhancing its product safety and compliance programs. That is something, it's not entirely new. It's definitely something we see in a lot of other areas of the law, regulatory law, definitely in terms of financial services. There are often these types of third-party audits or reports to the court later on about what the company has done, and that can go on for several years. It also did happen with Spectrum, which was litigated. We have not seen the requirement to have that kind of external report in a CPSC settlement for civil penalties, at least not recently. But that's definitely something CPSC may ask for in a settlement as part of not just sort of getting their pound of flesh with civil monetary penalties, but also continued oversight of the company. I mean, CPSC civil monetary penalties definitely have always included an undertaking to have a compliance program, but not that extra level of a third-party review and audit of that. But I can see CPSC adopting that as a standard requirement in the future.
Okay, before I call on Michelle and Mike, I just want to point out that starting in 1992, the corporate sentencing guidelines included so-called mitigation factors. So if you did the things that are in those mitigation factors, DOJ would actually give you credit and have a lower civil penalty or criminal penalty attempted to be levied against the company. CPSC started thinking about that, I think in the 2000s or 2010s. I think it was the DISO settlement agreement that was the first one that incorporated those safety procedures and mitigation procedures. I'd like to know from any of the three of you whether you think if a company has safety procedures in place that are part of those consent decrees, whether that will be taken into account by the CPSC lawyers in deciding whether to proceed in a timeliness investigation or penalty, or whether the commissioners would. So can we use these as mitigation factors, or would they be considered as mitigation factors if we do what the CPSC asks us to do with our safety programs?
Well, so the regulations around sort of how CPSC should calculate civil monetary penalties do discuss both aggravating and mitigating circumstances. But I don't think any CPSC enforcement lawyer has ever been able to identify anything that is a mitigating circumstance. They're more focused on aggravating factors. So I wouldn't be too optimistic in terms of it actually having a material effect.
Yeah, I agree. The only mitigating factor I ever see mentioned is ability to pay. And for the companies that CPSC tends to pursue for penalties, ability to pay is not generally a critical question. So, I would say no, because I think the argument would always be, either you don't have a program or you do have a program and it's inadequate.
Right. I would agree with that. From my time at CPSC, being a compliance attorney, it was looked at, well, you had a compliance program, but you failed anyway. So, I mean, that's the attitude. I did want to just go back on civil penalties and just say, for a period of time, in my experience, like in 2018 through 2020, the civil penalty investigations by staff had dwindled to like a trickle. There was not much going on. I can say for myself and my colleagues at Arnold and Porter, the tap has been turned on. It's not a fire hose, but in the last, I'd say 6 months or so, the investigations are starting up again. And, and I've got them at various stages right now. So, and one of the reasons I mentioned that is like, yes, I think we are seeing more investigations, and we will continue to see more investigations. And that's significant, not just because of, the penalty, if there is a penalty determination and a company pays a penalty, obviously, there's monetary consequences, there's your name and your brand reputation, but the investigation itself is costly. So, an investigation that goes away after 2 years could still run you an exorbitant amount of money. And so I think you are going to see an overall uptick in investigations. And just real quickly on GRI, I think, GRI is a game changer because, as Boaz said, it's the first corporate criminal penalties, but the first corporate criminal penalties for late reporting, right? Like that, and they were penalized for late reporting civilly 5 years earlier. So we've never seen anything like that. So they pay 15.5 for knowingly violating the Section 15 reporting requirement, and then later it's the knowingly and willful. And anyone that's read the charging documents and the DPA, we can all sit there and go, that is so egregious. Like the quotes from the emails, I mean, they're just like astounding. But it would be unwise to look at that and just say, well, we're not like that, because I think we know how bad it can be, but we don't know where DOJ or CPSC is going to, strike the balance on. You're not GRI, but this sure as hell something that we think should be looked at criminally. And I can say, I think it was Boaz who was saying anecdotally, hearing from staff that, they're looking at more than just corrective action. We know that they're thinking about GRI, because GRI is like supercharged the atmosphere just in conversations with staff. They're saying things that I know they're looking for the next GRI. So that's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Michelle. And I think, on that we're not GRI sort of mindset, I think from CPSC's standpoint, the argument you're going to get is that may be a difference in degree, but it's not a difference in the nature of what's going on. And so we're going to be just as interested in it. But I think that sort of segues to where I see compliance and enforcement heading, particularly if Mary does come on board and there is a majority. Obviously she's been around the agency for quite a while, but at the same time, Trumka and Hohensarik have been tangentially involved in these issues, but they're not steeped in 4 decades of CPSC lore the way some recent commissioners have been. And so I think novelty is going to be a significant theme through CPSC enforcement. We see that with GRI, with not only an indictment against the company, but the indictments against the officers specifically. I think that consistent with the Yates memo from the Obama administration, is something that we're going to see DOJ return to across the consumer protection sort of spectrum. We've also seen an increase in penalties for sale of recalled goods, and I think we'll see CPSC exploring some of its other prohibited acts, potentially possibly Section 37 that I like to talk about more than anybody else on the planet. Maybe that's just because I'm weird. But I also, as Boaz said, we've never seen a penalty for a failure to report when there wasn't also a recall. But under the statute, that is technically possible. And so I think we could see CPSC trying to sort of make a statement underscoring that when in doubt report thing by finding a good cherry-picked example of a company that ultimately didn't have to do a recall but really should have raised its hand a whole lot sooner. I think it would be a bold case for CPSC to try to make, but when you've got new blood coming in, you've got people who are trying to establish themselves, to establish their careers, I think that's the sort of thing that might be on the table.
Well, again, I'll throw in the product liability piece of it because that's of also great interest to me. And most punitive damage awards in product liability are based on the failure of a company after they learn about safety problems of not doing enough to take care of them, whether that involves reporting, whether that involves recalls, the timing issues. And therefore, companies should be looking at these so-called best practices that are contained in these consent agreements, because you could be asked, why aren't you doing these things? So it may not have, as Michelle's talking about, it may not have any effect on the compliance attorney as a mitigation factor, but it might be very helpful in at least lowering the temperature with the plaintiff's attorney in seeking punitive damages, or the jury in awarding punitive damages. So if you can say, we followed all the best practices out there, what companies do. We did the best we could. This one snuck through because of a bad apple who didn't listen when we told them what to do. Or if you got that kind of a story, I think that can be helpful, certainly in a case and in front of a jury if they're seeking punitive damages. So that's another example of the interrelationship between the two, and how we can't just look at this as a regulatory issue, but in many cases, it's much broader than that. Okay, anything else on that? I guess just on matter of timing, just to remind everybody, we scheduled another 15 minutes because of all the speakers, and so there is time for questions, but we'll quickly do the last session here on commission level rulemaking priorities and legislation, and I'll ask Mike to take the lead on that.
Sure, and a lot of the rulemaking priorities, obviously each commissioner, each of the new commissioners will have, sort of new priorities, new areas of interest they'll bring with them. They didn't show their hands too much at their confirmation hearings in terms of what those might be, but I'm sure we'll see them unfurl as time goes on. But I think a lot of the rulemaking priorities that are currently in front of the commission are ones that have been in front of the commission for some time. We did see finally the issue of furniture flammability resolved by Congress a couple of years ago after pending for a very, very long time, such that it had its own driver's license. But we do have other issues that have been longstanding. I think furniture tip over, dresser tip over specifically is one that's going to be of keen interest for all of the commissioners. They've all expressed a willingness and an appetite to engage on that subject and to move that issue forward. We did see the magnet rule voted back out after its trip to court just a couple of months ago. We've got pending litigation on the phthalates rule that is a little bit different in nature because the court just sent it back to bolster the rationale, but didn't vacate the rule. But there are a number of issues of that nature. The organohalogen flame retardant petition that came up to the commission about 5-6 years ago and is still pending and is under review by a chronic hazard advisory panel. We'll see what comes from that. So I think a lot of these legacy issues are still ones that are in front of the commission. We'll see if this is the body that lands the plane on those, or if they continue to sort of eat up agency resources and last on. I think some of the priorities may not necessarily be rulemaking, but structural. We've seen now a move toward mandatory use of the online portal through saferproducts.gov for fast track reports. And I think seeking to regularize the reporting structure and force companies into standard lanes that make it easier for the agency to process. I think those kinds of structural changes are going to be significant for the agency. Obviously, we saw an increase in funding for import surveillance come out of some of the stimulus money and similar packages. And so I think stepping up the presence at the ports, not only physically, but through the use of digital tools, will be a point of emphasis. So it may be those sort of how the agency does business points that are going to be the points of emphasis more than particular product categories. And of course, as we say, everybody will bring their own priorities and share those when they feel it's appropriate. On the legislative side, I thought as this Congress got started last year, there might be more movement. Frankly, there's been less than I expected this Congress. At the same time, there are issues that are in front of Congress, bills that have either been filed or passed out of committee, either this Congress or the last, on some of the greatest hit sorts of issues of CPSC practice. Obviously, Section 6B and CPSC information disclosure is prime among those. And I think we'll continue to see legislative efforts or calls for legislative efforts to either pare back or remove Section 6B entirely. We've seen a lot of pressure on Section 7 and 9 rulemaking, which is the standard process CPSC has to use to issue rules. It is described as sort of an outlier in that it requires more of the agency than traditional Administrative Procedure Act rulemaking does in terms of cost-benefit analysis and that sort of thing. The other half of that statement that's not shared is that executive branch agencies have to go through the same thing under the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. So it's not that novel, but it is something that appears to be different in the CPSC process and has been a target of criticism for some time, with the argument being that it burdens the agency too much and the agency can't execute on its priorities even once it identifies them. And then we mentioned earlier the Amazon case, the question of where the modern economy fits in the CPSA structure, I think is another big one that will be resolved one way or another. I think that's an area, given the sort of bipartisan animus toward big tech, as the phrase is now, I think that of all these CPSC issues, if you can find bipartisan consensus to move forward, something that annoys big tech is something that might be popular across the aisle. I think the other legislative piece, it's not a legislative issue, it's not a statutory issue, but it is the question of funding. Obviously, Congress has the power of the purse. We have seen, obviously, we're still under continuing resolutions. I kind of think we're going to be under CRs for the rest of this Congress. But there were proposals, the appropriations bills, as they stand, do call for increases, varying levels of increases, but increases for CPSC funding. I think there's been unanimity across much of the CPSC community, not all, but much, that the agency does need more money, at least in certain areas. And so I think if Congress does get around to actually appropriating, I think we'll see some level of increase for CPSC. And then I think that will be the best opportunity we've had for identifying where the priorities of the new commissioners are, because the clearest way to know where somebody wants to move the agency is where they want to spend new money. So as these issues percolate through the rest of this Congress, again, it's an election year, it's a particularly tense election year. And so, I would say most people who would watch issues on the Hill that are not the front of line issues, not the tariff issues, not the major issues that have dominated the headlines, but more niche questions like CPSC. If there's not movement on those by April, May, June, they're probably not going to go anywhere. So I think right now is the time to be watching what's going on in Congress, and to the extent you've got an interest in a particular bill, to be engaging. I think that's one thing we constantly hear from members, is that they don't hear enough from companies who have issues and dealings with CPSC. Companies understandably are reluctant to attach their names to especially opposition to something dealing with CPSC. I certainly understand that, but that's why trade associations exist. And that's why there are other channels to get those messages.
Hey, sorry, I should have had my session open because I knew I was going to forget if I get caught up in some of the
Larry, you're talking to everybody. Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Hang on, Lord.
With that, I would just say, if you've got issues you care about that deal with CPSC that you think are moving legislatively, or you would like to see move, or you would want congressional attention brought to, find a way to engage with Congress, because the consumer advocacy community, as it should be, is very active on the Hill, and has great relationships with a number of members. And the voice of companies sometimes doesn't get through. And I think a lot of that is companies, again, reluctant to engage publicly. I would say find a way to get those messages through, because that, the great debate, the public discourse is how we make decisions. And if you're not, the phrase I always love from the Hill, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I would suggest that being engaged in CPSC issues is critical going forward.
Okay, Michelle, you got anything you would like to add on that?
No, I'd be happy to get to any questions if there are any from the.
Okay, well,
audience.
let's check with Boaz first. Anything to add, Boaz?
No, same here. I think we should get to some questions if we have any. I see there is one in the chat, but I don't know if you've gotten more yourself.
No, let's see. And I don't think that's a question, actually. Oops, there's a question. Oh, we do have a question here. Good. What developments do we foresee within CPSC around artificial intelligence and machine learning and consumer products, both in terms of enforcement and regulatory developments? Anybody?
I'll take the back half of that, the regulatory development side. I think, we mentioned an increase in port funding and an increase in port staffing. Boaz remembers well from the days we were there that there was discussion of using artificial intelligence to do data analytics in the way that the private sector does. That effort went nowhere, unfortunately. Obviously the agency is limited in its funding, and sometimes exploring new pathways like that can be a bit daunting. But I think the re-emphasis on import surveillance is going to maybe push that along a little further. CPSC, even with the additional funding that it may be getting, is still going to be a very small agency with a very limited ability to physically be at the ports and physically put its hands on products. So any opportunity it has to figure out where to use those limited resources, I think, is valuable to CPSC. So I think with the new blood, and this has been a theme of Commissioner Biaco's especially, is to get into the tech business in a way that can bootstrap the agency's resources and make it more effective. So I do think there will be a renewed discussion of those opportunities on the regulatory side.
Yeah, and then in terms of like product safety and the use of artificial intelligence or machine learning, I'm sure CPSC, like it did with connected products and like it tried to do with nanotech under Adler, is going to show an interest and a willingness to try to engage on this. CPSC, as Neil and I like to say, is very likely to, if there's any agency out there that's going to overstep its either authority or its abilities, CPSC is probably the one to do it. It doesn't really have the in-house capabilities to deal with these technologies in any really informed way. I think it's been having a very hard time dealing with connected products, the Internet of Things, and sort of understanding the role of firmware and software and just sort of grasping what it means for these to be updated and the restrictions, I think, on companies' ability to provide source code and things like that. But I think there's a lot of appetite among consumer advocates for this to be a new frontier of discussions of safety, including fairness and other issues that these technologies bring up, and the confluence between those and safety. So there's going to be a discussion. I just don't know that CPSC is going to be able to do much more than maybe do some investigations and reports. And then if they can get a recall related to one of these things, they'll be happy to do it. But with all the discussion of connected products, I think maybe there was only one product that actually, I mean, there have been connected products that were recalled, but never because of the connectivity being the safety issue. Sometimes the connectivity allows for a more creative way to do the fix or communicate the recall, but the connectivity itself, the fact that it is a smart device, as the hazard that is the source of the recall, that hasn't really manifested. And I would wager that that's likely to be the case, at least in the near future, with these technologies as well.
Michelle, do you have anything? Are you aware of? I mean, I saw a year or two ago a sort of a cross-agency task force. So because it's the same issue involving NHTSA, FDA products also. So it's not just limited to consumer products. And I remember seeing some task force developed in multi-agency. I haven't kept track of what they're doing exactly, but I haven't seen any announcements of any grand principles. But I think they're struggling with it partly because the technology is changing so fast, and the ability to hack, the ability to counteract some of these activities. I did see, I think yesterday, that there are manufacturers of firearms that are working on firearms that basically are have software in there so that you cannot use the firearm unless, without either face recognition or finger recognition or fingerprint recognition, something like that. So I think the technology is still evolving on it quickly enough. And as you guys know better than anybody, the government moves pretty darn slowly. So I assume that the industry is going to be far out in front on that, driving this issue. And the standards development folks probably will be doing this much more than the CPSC will. So sorry, I don't have any current updates on this, but they are thinking about this. I have been involved over the years with global navigation systems as they were developed in the 1990s, and they have evolved so greatly over the years. And we sat down in the 1990s to try to figure out the product safety problems from those ancient global navigation systems in your cars. And I'm sure they're doing that right now with all of this stuff, with all of these kinds of things. And but coming up with answers to it is going to be very difficult, since it's one big, huge moving target. And again, the government moves so slowly that it's so we ought to have a session on that later on. And on that point, if any of you are still on the listening here today, have ideas for webinars you would like to have, and just the email, as you can see, info@productsafetyprofessionals.org. Email your suggestions for webinars. There might be enough going on at some point on AI, machine learning, to do something. At the moment, I just haven't seen a whole lot going on. Let me just check and see if we've got any other. I don't see any other questions. Anybody have anything from a wrap-up standpoint? Well, we got 1 minute. So anything else you want to add? Or okay, seeing no takers, then I will call this session to a close. Thank you all for sticking around. Hopefully we didn't keep you too long here, but with 3 speakers, we want to give everybody an opportunity to participate. If you have questions later, you can email any of us with your questions, and we'll try to get back to you if there are answers. And just to pay attention to what SPSP is doing. We've got a new expanded board. We're doing a lot of webinars this year. We're trying to be of more service to manufacturers and those who advise manufacturers. Our focus is much narrower than ICFSO or other organizations involved in product safety. So we have the ability to provide you more directed information on this subject, and happy to consider any suggestions you all have for things that we can do to be more helpful to you in your daily jobs in product safety. So with that, thank you all very much. This program will be placed on our website, archived. So if you want to watch it again, or more importantly, you have other people in your organization who you think ought to look at it, please have them go to that website. And on behalf of SPSP and Sedgwick Brand Protection, thank you all for attending today and listening in. Thank you. And thanks all to the speakers. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.